Governments love to declare they are champions of your financial freedom. They promise stability, prosperity, and opportunity. Yet when you study the record with a cold eye, a harsher pattern emerges. States repeatedly deploy hidden financial devices that drain ordinary people while fortifying the power and wealth of those who govern or orbit the centers of influence. The unsettling truth is not their novelty, but their persistence. The same mechanisms are rebadged across eras, wrapped in new rhetoric, and sold as fresh solutions, always converging on the same outcome. Wealth lifted upward, dependence pushed downward. Start with the oldest, most deceptively simple device: inflation. When officials spend beyond what they can collect through explicit taxes, they face a choice. They can reveal the cost and raise taxes in daylight, politically dangerous. Or they can quietly cheapen the money. Ancient Rome refined this tactic. In the 3rd century CE, emperors under fiscal and military strain shaved the silver from the denarius, replacing precious metal with base alloy. Coins that once held real substance became plated tokens. Nominal values stayed the same. Real value leaked away. Savers saw purchasing power erode. Wages lagged rising prices. Trade grew unstable. It was a silent levy that spared politicians the spectacle of a tax vote while extracting the same resource. Your time converted into money, then diluted. By the way, if you love money, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Now, let's continue. The medieval toolkit added a second move: coerced loans. Kings across England, France, and Spain leaned on merchants, guilds, and wealthy households to lend funds to the crown. Refusal risked fees, seizures, and sometimes prison. Promissory notes might include interest and grand assurances. Yes, settlement arrived late, clipped by devaluation, or not at all. The message was patriotism, the mechanism was compulsion. War chests filled, private capital bled away. The trick worked because it blurred duty with fear and wrapped coercion in the language of loyalty. By the late 17th century, the financial system itself became the instrument. Britain's founding of the Bank of England in 1694 was not an act of charity. It was a war measure. Investors bought government debt. The crown pledged interest serviced by excises on salt, beer, cloth, and other necessities. On paper, this looked like elegant statecraft. In practice, it routed guaranteed returns to bondholders while shifting the bill to everyday consumers. From that point forward, the safest asset for the wealthy became claims on taxpayers, warehoused as risk-free sovereign bonds income streams, ultimately funded by the purchases and labor of the many. Modern variants are everywhere. Deficit spending is sold as stimulus, jobs, or national renewal. Bonds are issued by the trillions, purchased by institutions, banks, and foreign creditors. Money circulates, but follow the flows, and you find swollen contracts, subsidies, and rescues concentrated at the top. When debts mature, the political system seldom trims privileges near power. Instead, it raises taxes, hollows benefits, or lets inflation do quiet work. The theater says the borrowing is for the people. The ledger shows the burden landing on them while profits accrue to the creditors. Consider bailouts. In 2008, leverage and opaque securitization nearly detonated the financial core. Losses were socialized through extraordinary rescue programs. Institutions deemed systemic survived and then consolidated. The rule crystallized. Privatize gains, socialize losses. The audience was told the performance saved the system. The caste who designed it emerged enlarged and fewer in number. Public pensions and national retirement schemes add another sleight of hand. Workers contribute for decades on the promise of future income. Yet governments often spend contributions immediately and leave internal IOUs in trust funds. The pledge is that future taxpayers, many not yet born, will honor yesterday's promises. This intergenerational chain works until demographics turn, dependency ratios rise, growth slows, and the math breaks. Reform then arrives, benefits trimmed, eligibility delayed, or payouts devalued by inflation. The official words change, the transfer remains. Notice the core dependency on perception. Words anesthetize. Inflation is rebranded as growth or heating the economy. Forced loans become patriotic contributions. Expanding debt is framed as investment. Bailouts are stability operations. Pension cuts are sustainability. The vocabulary muffles the transfer. Without historical literacy, the public sees isolated events rather than a recurring design. In the last 2 decades, the repertoire added an especially technical move: quantitative easing. Most people had never heard the term before the global financial crisis. Central banks created vast sums in digital form and bought government bonds and mortgage securities. Officials said it was necessary to prevent collapse. In market terms, it did its job. Yields fell, asset prices rose, and portfolios recovered. But most financial assets are owned by upper deciles. If you held stocks, prime real estate, or long-duration bonds, you rode a wave. If your wealth lived mainly in wages, the benefits were muted. The downside lived in distorted prices and a higher cost of living. QE saved the system's architecture while widening the gap between owners of assets and sellers of labor. Another contemporary lever is stealth taxation. Rather than hike headline income rates, authorities rely on value-added taxes, fuel duties, bracket creep, fees, and, most insidiously, persistent inflation. When prices outpace pay, the difference functions as a hidden levy on purchasing power and savings. Governments favor this because it invisibly deflates their own obligations. Citizens feel it as a slow theft of time. Layered atop these is regulatory capture. Rules are advertised as public shields, but durable industries tend to shape the shields to fit their contours. Railroads in the 19th century, oil and heavy industry in the 20th, finance and big tech in the 21st all mastered the art of influencing the referee. Compliance regimes become moats. The largest incumbents can afford the lawyers and lobbyists. Smaller rivals drown in fixed costs. Consumers face fewer options and higher prices. The posture is protection. The outcome is profit. War finance recurs in every age. During the World Wars, bonds were marketed as patriotic instruments. Citizens did support their nations, and large investors also secured low-risk returns backed by future tax receipts. In the new century, long conflicts were financed through borrowing that enriched defense contractors, banks, and bond desks, while the public inherited compound costs. Every war is pitched as temporary. Its debts arrive with generational interest. Complexity itself becomes armor. Tax codes sprawl, budget documents balloon into thousands of pages, and acronyms multiply. Financial instruments layer options on derivatives on debts until even professionals need a whiteboard and a weekend. In Rome, you could feel the fraud in a light coin. Today, the debasement hides in spreadsheets and legalese. If the public cannot trace the flows, it cannot challenge them. Why emphasize this now? Because the cadence has quickened. Inflation gnaws at savings. Debt loads climb. When trouble strikes markets, default responses lean toward rescue. Central banks fine-tune liquidity, suppress yields, and steer expectations. Governments shift costs in indirect ways most people never associate with policy. The outcome is a machine that keeps many running faster for less durable wealth, while a smaller cohort accumulates claims on the future. History is clear on the human results. Roman citizens watched purchasing power erode. Medieval merchants saw their capital commandeered. Modern households discover that borrowed booms turn into drawn-out hangovers settled from their pay. Across these episodes, the mechanisms rhyme even as the costumes change. The harsh truth is that most people will not sidestep these traps because they are unaware the game is on. They mistake inflation for fate, taxes for nature, and bailouts for benevolence. They internalize slogans instead of studying incentives. That cultivated ignorance is the master key. A public untrained in financial history is easier to steer. Education is a shield. Literacy is leverage. Know the plays, and you become harder to herd. What should you do with this perspective? First, interrogate headlines. When a stimulus is announced, ask who receives money first and who bears risk later. When inflation rises, recognize policy choices underneath. When new regulations appear, follow the authors and the beneficiaries. Second, build resilience in assets that resist debasement productive skills, diversified claims on real activity, and stores of value less tethered to political discretion. Third, never assume any system is designed for you just because it says it is. Systems exist first to perpetuate themselves. Remember, history does not repeat word for word, but it does rhyme loudly. The tricks that drained Roman purses echo in modern monetary policy. The forced loans of kings show up as mandates, fees, and compelled contributions. The bond ladders of early central banking live on in today's sovereign debt markets and liquidity facilities. To see the pattern is to shorten your learning curve. To ignore it is to fund it. Zoom in on the plumbing for a moment. Inflation is not a mystical fog. It travels through specific channels. New money never arrives everywhere at once. It flows first to those closest to the spigot governments, banks, primary dealers, subsidized firms. That early access buys assets and contracts at yesterday's prices. By the time wages and consumer prices adjust, the distributional effect is locked in. Economists call this the Cantillon effect. New money changes relative prices and redistributes purchasing power. Add in seigniorage, the profit of issuing currency at a cost below its face value, and you have the oldest revenue source of all. Value skimmed before the public notices the dilution. The same asymmetry appears in tax design. Bracket creep silently lifts effective rates as nominal incomes drift higher, even if real purchasing power does not. Complex credits and deductions, marketed as relief, often require accountants and software that lower earners cannot afford. Consumption taxes bite proportionally harder at the bottom. Fees masquerading as service charges proliferate. You do not need a conspiracy when incentives do the steering. Deficits deserve the same clear-eyed treatment. There is nothing inherently immoral about borrowing to build long-lived assets. The problem is the habitual mismatch between the rhetoric of shared uplift and the reality of concentrated benefit. If much of the borrowed money buys political favor, supports incumbents, or rescues private balance sheets after reckless bets, then citizens are financing past mistakes rather than future capacity. That pattern turns debt from a bridge into an anchor. Quantitative easing operated with similar distributional gears. By removing duration risk from markets and pressing yields toward zero, central banks nudged investors into equities, real estate, and credit. Balance sheets that already held those assets swelled. Those living mainly on wages did not see equivalent gains. Meanwhile, savers hunting for safe income faced near zero returns. For retirees on fixed income, that policy backdrop felt like standing on a slowly tilting floor. The stated goal was macro stability. The side effect was accentuated inequality. Bailouts, too, are better understood as incentive machines. Every rescue raises the expected value of future risk-taking by large players. When executives and creditors learn that the downside is capped by public intervention, balance sheets grow bolder in the next cycle. That is the textbook definition of moral hazard. Policymakers often reply that, this time we reformed the rules. But the next crisis tends to prove that the players adapted faster than the referees. Regulatory capture rarely looks like a bribe. It looks like an expert advisory panel stocked with alumni from the regulated industry, a revolving door that turns watchdogs into well-paid strategic advisors, or a technical rule change whose costs are invisible to non-specialists. The end product is a codebase that rewards incumbency, locks in market share, and grants pricing power that would never survive open competition. For the consumer, the costs show up as fewer choices and creeping fees. For startups, as barriers that turn ambition into attrition. War finance compresses these dynamics into a single narrative. Emergency messaging becomes the blanket that covers long-term fiscal commitments. Bonds marketed with stirring posters and glossy campaigns are bought by citizens, yes, but also in enormous blocks by institutions. After the banners are folded, the coupons continue, the contractors book revenue, and the debt service quietly claims a share of future taxes. The emotional appeal is temporary, the cash flows are not. Complexity, finally, is not just camouflage, it is a moat. If you need a credentialed translator to read a budget, the democratic oversight function has already been weakened. If a derivatives risk requires a PhD to explain, retail investors cannot sensibly evaluate it. If a public program's cost is scattered across a dozen agencies and time horizons, no single committee will ever own the full picture. Complexity is a feature for those who benefit from opacity. If you made it this far, Drop a plus in the comments your badge for finishing the deep dive. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more long-form stories where money, history, and power collide. Curious about earlier empires of capital? Check out our others video.